So welcome everyone to the inaugural BC Support Unit Methods Cluster Journal Club. Inaugural one of two. There's another one coming up. When's the second one? July the 26th, I think? Yes. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. And I would like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join us in this discussion. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations from whose traditional lands we're leading this meeting today. My name is Pat Atherton, and I'm responsible for training with the BC Support Unit, and I'm here with colleagues on West Broadway. I'm going to start the presentation with some opening remarks by Linda Lee, who is the lead for the
Knowledge Translation, Implementation Science, Methods Cluster.
Thank you. The KTIS Methods Cluster. The voice you just heard is Sterling Bryan, who is our scientific director here at the BC Support Unit. So Linda, are you ready to get underway with your slide deck?
Sure. Welcome everyone. It's really exciting to see so many people are interested in the topic. It sort of started, this topic started as a much smaller discussion, and so it's kind of nice to see the interest in everyone to learn together. So just to get everyone thinking around effectiveness implementation hybrid design, I'd like to give you a bit of sense where I am and where how this discussion come about and get everybody start talking. So a bit of disclosure and disclaimer. I myself firmly believe that we need innovative methods to evaluate and implement effective health services interventions, and that's what sort of attracted me to this innovative set of designs to think about how to evaluate effectiveness and implementation interventions at the same time. But I have to say that I'm not an expert in these designs, so I would welcome discussion and look forward to hearing experiences from some of you. Hopefully, some of you in the in this call have more experience in this area, so it's an opportunity for me to learn from you, and also for everyone to learn from each other as well. And of course, like many of you, I want to know about the designs because I'm submitting a grant, and I'm sure some of you are at the same place as well. And I'm also very keen to work with people who are also interested in these designs. So that was the reason why we decided to design this particular session as a journal club, so that it's a safe place for all of us to learn from each other, and it's by no means didactic, type of session. Just because I certainly don't feel comfortable in talking, with a lot of expertise in this area. So how did this come about? Pat and Sterling has mentioned that I am the lead for the Knowledge Translation and Implementation Science Methods Cluster for the BC Support Unit. In March last year, we had a stakeholder consultation, or a series of stakeholder consultations to identify a vision and themes where we want to develop research projects in order to advance the science in KT and implementation. So through a lot of discussion in about around a 6 to 7 month period, the community of KT and implementation science have come up with these 4 themes for potential projects. And as you can see, theme number 1 was to advance the use of innovative research methods for studying KT and implementation interventions. And within that, we actually want to specifically examine the appropriate use of different designs, including...
Sorry, Linda. Sorry just to interrupt you. You're getting a lot of background noise, so I just wonder whether people who are typing at this point could mute their line so that we don't hear that and we can hear Linda clearly. Is that okay? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so one of the study designs that was discussed quite a bit in our stakeholder consultations was to look at the effectiveness and implementation hybrid designs, especially in the context of knowledge translation and implementation type of research. So part of the discussion came from this very interesting article that I believe all of you have had a chance to review, written by Jeffrey Kern and his colleagues in the Veterans Healthcare System in the States. And they eloquently depicted 3 different types of methods to think about how we actually accelerate the evaluation of a clinical intervention as well as health services intervention. So thinking about the implementation design at the same time when we're evaluating the clinical intervention, instead of thinking around it as what we traditionally do clinical and health services research as in a sequential manner. So this is a very, I guess, simplistic way of my understanding of effectiveness implementation hybrid designs. And there are 3 different types as depicted in Kern's article. So I'll try to describe them, and I look forward to hearing from others if you have a different interpretation of how Kern described those designs. So essentially, the hybrid 1 design is the type of study that we know that we have some data on the preliminary effectiveness, or the more importantly, the efficacy of a clinical intervention, where we at the point that we want to do our phase 3 trial to look at effectiveness. But at the same time, we build in a component to study the process of implementing these type of the clinical intervention. And so this type of design would help to prepare researchers and research teams to think around different ways to implement the clinical intervention, should it be found effective when the study is done. So I think a lot of us are actually more familiar with the hybrid 1 design. So for example, like myself, I'm a physical therapist by background. We look at interventions to implement ways to help people to be more physically active with chronic diseases. So we have looked at different types of clinical interventions, different types of structure of research programs, and have some data to look at what type of package would be the most effective for the population that I'm interested in, particularly in people with arthritis. So when we're doing the effectiveness trial with a larger community-based group of participants, we also built in a process evaluation that we interview participants and look at sort of what works and what doesn't work, what are the barriers to uptake of the exercise program that we were testing. So my understanding was that we're kind of doing a hybrid 1 design in the example that I've just given, but interestingly, I'm happy to share with you some of my failure story that we submitted a grant to CIHR about a year and a half ago and got some really interesting feedback. So we got 5 reviewers. 3 of them said that that's great, this is exactly what you need to do, and 2 of them said that, well, why would you even think about implementation when you're still testing the effectiveness of the exercise program? So, so that's sort of my experience with the type 1 design. Now, the type 2 and type 3 are a little bit more complex in my view. So in the type 2 design, you're testing a clinical intervention and an implementation intervention simultaneously. So my understanding from reading Kern's paper would be that usually people would think about using a factorial, sort of research design that they are testing the clinical intervention as well as the implementation, the health services component at the same time. And depending on the resources that the team has, you may have one, the clinical intervention or the implementation intervention as properly powered in the study, and also you have very clearly defined primary outcome for evaluating the clinical component as well as the health services component of the intervention. The type 3 design, on the other hand, would focus on testing the implementation strategy while collecting information on the clinical intervention and the related outcomes. So my understanding of the type 3 design would be that it's suitable if two conditions are met. So first of all, when there is evidence that the clinical intervention has worked in related situations, but not the situation in question. So, for example, it could be that we're testing a weight management intervention that has been shown to be effective in people with diabetes, but it has not been used in people with, say, osteoarthritis. And now we're testing, this clinical intervention, the weight management intervention in people with osteoarthritis. So the second condition would be that there is a strong momentum for implementation within the clinical system. So, for example, if we have a partner with a health authority that is very keen in testing different innovative ways to implement weight management program, for example, then that would be the right sort of combination that we have a clinical intervention that we know quite a bit about around the effectiveness and the evidence, but we have an implementation strategy that we don't know if it works really well, but we have partners who are very interested in testing the implementation strategy itself. And so that would sort of be the condition that would allow us to test the implementation strategy as the primary target, but also collecting clinical intervention data in the study. So perhaps I'm not explaining it as well as it could be, but it's sort of my understanding of the three types of hybrid design. So what I would like us to maybe to think a little bit about are some of the discussion topics that I listed on these slides right there. So I would very much like to hear sort of what is your understanding of the three types of the effectiveness implementation hybrid designs, and what are your experience, especially with type 2 and type 3. Also, where do you see these kind of designs can be used in your own research program? So if you have examples that you would like to share, would love to hear about that. And of course, I also would really much like to think through a little bit about the potential challenges of applying these type of designs, especially, again, type 2 and type 3. I think we probably have varying experiences with type 1 as well, especially people who do mixed qualitative, quantitative research in testing interventions. And finally, I think it would be very helpful to hear your suggestions for the subsequent sort of discussions that you would like to see, or the direction where this journal club is going to be. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Sterling, who's going to guide our discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Linda. And at this point, I think I'd like to make sure that we have an opportunity to introduce Hubert Wong. So Hubert is our methods cluster lead at the support unit for the real-world clinical trials topic. And Hubert has joined the Journal Club this time and will actually be taking a lead on the subsequent Journal Club. And also Alison Holmes, who is our knowledge translation specialist for the methods cluster at the support unit as well. So I'm expecting that both Hubert and Alison are going to be active participants in this journal club as well as others. So and it's great to see so many people. But thank you very much, Linda, for those opening remarks. And I'm working on the assumption that everyone has had the opportunity to read the current paper. I did suggest doing a poll to people to self-declare whether they had actually read the paper or not, but I was advised that that wouldn't be a good idea, so we're not doing that. So we're not going to name and shame people who have not. But the first thing that we wanted just to get some discussion on was relating to understanding of the three types. So wanting just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the three types. Actually, Linda, maybe you could leave the discussion topics up, if you wouldn't mind. That would be helpful then, just to sort of, we can use that as a structure for our conversation, if that's okay.
Great. Sterling, are you still seeing the slide with the discussion topics?
Yeah, that's up at the moment. If that's okay, we'll just leave that there, if that's okay with you, Linda.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and understanding the three types that have been described. So any questions or comments in relation to the types, making just points of clarification or questions? And it's not going to be a back and forth between ourselves and any questions. We just want to raise issues that we may jointly have questions about. So any questions in terms of the three types, and just wanting to clarify what we understand by those types?
It's Rick here, Rick Swatsky.
Oh, Rick, sorry, I would have introduced you if I'd known you were online. Apologies.
No,
so Rick Swatsky is our methods cluster lead for patient-centered measurement. So thank you for joining us, Rick. So you've got a question?
Yeah, well, just to comment, that is indeed my understanding of the three types. I'm always a bit nervous because the same happened type of thing happened in kind of the mixed methods research methodologies, where we had all these different types of typologies that were being generated. And I think that's probably helpful at the initial stages. But really, what I found most helpful from this article is how, kind of a general classification of designs is being constructed to link efficacy type of studies to implementation science. And I think that's the overall type of objective that's being achieved. And I guess I would encourage that the typology that's been created in this article is just a starting point, and there's a lot of flux between these different types of typologies, and not to essentialize them too much, and rather to get at the underlying principles. Because the other thing I liked in the article quite a bit was where was that table on linking the different terminologies? It was right in the beginning on the key definitions of terms, which is really quite revealing, because this type of work has been going on a long time. Like the type of research that I do very much uses language of formative evaluation, for instance, to get at kind of similar types of principles. So I'm wondering I'm actually very curious what the rest, what other folks think who are online about, is there a need for like actually explicit typologies, or should we get at kind of underlying priorities and principles and what we're trying to achieve, recognizing that there's many different ways of getting there under the umbrella of maybe a general typology of hybrid designs. That was a lot of words for a very short message,
great.
Actually. Sorry.
I think that's very helpful, Rick. Thank you very much for that. And I think I certainly share that the rigidity of the typologies. I didn't necessarily I felt it was more of a, there's more of a spectrum, I think, of, and sort of being clear where a particular study would fit, I think isn't necessarily all that clear to me. Hubert, I don't know if you want to, is this material that you're familiar with and have worked with previously, or is this an area of learning, anything you want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, this is all pretty new to me too. I mean, I think I'm sort of in the same boat as what Linda was saying, where we were submitting these grants where we were putting in evaluations of processes and not calling them hybrid designs, and yet, in a sense, they were these type 1 designs. And I agree also with Rick that, I don't think we want to get too hung up on typology, but to focus on what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish in a given trial, and how do we best do that.
Yeah.
May I chime in a little bit?
Of course.
Okay. So that's interesting. It's almost a bit of the growing pain of the design and the typology, perhaps. Again, going back to my really unpleasant experience of submitting a grant and getting really mixed reviews, and two of the reviewers really hung up on the term of the hybrid design, that the implementation actually comes in, the evaluation piece of the implementation came in so early, with what they had problem with. So the interesting thing was that I turned that grant around. It was for CIHR. I turned it around and submitted to somewhere else. Didn't really change anything, and that was fine. That actually got passed. So it's almost like the terminology that got people really uncomfortable with. But having said that, that was a year and a half ago, and when I did the, initially talk about this design at the visioning meeting at the KT implementation methods cluster, it was relatively new, and I did a Google search or the PubMed search of articles using this type of design. I found like about 20 articles. Right now, if you go to Implementation Science, the journal Implementation Science alone, there are a plethora of studies and protocols that are published with the type 1, type 2, type 3, and they actually use those terms. And my sense is that I think now more people will start thinking more about how to sort of combine the effectiveness and implementation evaluation together, that the terminology start to be more recognized. So I think it may be a good idea. Good timing for us to, sort of not only to learn a bit more about the design, but also think about how to, sort of move the field forward, especially for us doing research in BC.
Great, thanks. So others feel free to chime in.
Yeah, Rick here. I completely agree with that. But somehow, how do we link to the past decades of research that have been using principles of formative evaluation, process evaluation, integration of mixed methodologies with trials, linking that to implementation? Like somehow. It doesn't seem so new to me, actually. It's just new to a certain context of research. And the example that I have is a study that I submitted about 4 or 5 years ago, which really followed within this type 1 type of design, if we want to use that language. And the feedback, I'm still thinking of creating a poster of it or something, because the first sentence from one of the reviewers said, "This is not research," and which I thought, what planet are you on? But then we actually reconfigured and used. Actually, we just changed a little bit of language. So we actually moved away from implementation because it was a trial, so people were getting kind of hung up on this implementation idea. The design was almost identical. We changed some language, and And so, needless to say, the previous one got rejected flat out. The next one ranked first nationally in the entire competition, and it was basically the same design, just with some language changing. So it seems to me that what is needed here is actually a lot of, and what we're doing here right now is a lot of knowledge translation about, you know, this is not all just new stuff. It's actually, this is bringing together a whole world of things that have been done for a long time. We're just bringing them into a different context.
And so I think the message that hopefully we don't take away is that you just need to change the language once you've got a rejected grant and it'll get funded next time.
I know, but it was classic though. I mean, it went from a flat out rejection to rank #1.
Yeah, that's a great story. So, I mean, maybe we should try and hear from those who are not connected directly with the support unit, other folks who have joined us who, again, we're still on this sort of making sure we understand the typologies and any questions that people have, clarification points that people want to make. I've got one, but I want to listen to other people before I interject with mine. I could start picking on people to make contributions, but I don't necessarily want to do that. But I will do, I have to. So Marie, you've joined us, I think. Are you able to, yeah, excellent. So Marie was, I'm assuming this is Marie Westby, so you only put Marie. Are you on audio?
Yeah, can't hear you, Marie.
Oh, right. Oh, that's a shame.
Marie's microphone might not be configured.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. No, we can't hear you, I'm afraid. No, that's a shame.
Marie sent a note and said, asking whether we can hear her.
Yeah, no, we can't, unfortunately. So
yeah.
That's a shame. So maybe I'll just ask I'll just sort of put my thing on the table just as a clarification.
Marie could use the chat function.
Oh yeah, the chat function. So please feel free to use the chat function, and then we can actually we
could read it aloud.
Yeah.
So Marie, the chat function is just a little dialog box up in the top right-hand area. Looks like a cartoon thought balloon. And while you're composing your note, Sterling can chime in.
So for type 2, we're actually putting together the effectiveness and implementation. So we might have an an implementation intervention that we want to test, and we've also got an intervention that we want to test, a clinical intervention. And I think trying to test both of those simultaneously makes perfect sense. But how is that different from complex interventions? So there's a whole literature on complex intervention evaluation. There's a framework for evaluating complex interventions that's been developed over many years. It strikes me that, why aren't we just learning from that literature and applying it in this context? Because in essence, what you end up with when you're trying simultaneously to evaluate the intervention and its implementation, and you've got different strategies for both, that it becomes then just a complex or even potentially a highly complex intervention, and we've got a literature on that.
Sterling is Linda. It's a good point. And when I look into the literature in the type 2 design, to me those are factorial designs that people are using. But I guess what Kern and other methodologists are trying to do is to make sure that people are thinking around two different sets of intervention: the clinical intervention and the implementation of the health services intervention itself. So sometimes when you do factorial design, you can look at multiple clinical intervention, for example, right? But the hybrid design stipulates that the two sets of things that you're looking at are actually from different spheres. One is to address the clinical needs, and the other one is to address the health services need. So I wonder if that's the reason why they want to split it apart. Oh, I think Marie wrote something.
Yeah.
I have 3 comments
Good.
from the chat. I'll start with Don MacArthur and Amber Huey from BCCHRI and WHRI. They say, we've been listening and concur with discussion. We also have many clinical studies that are already hybrid and that they have secondary aims that cross over from EI and IE. Thanks. Not questions, but just comments.
Great.
Another comment from Marie. I agree, the highly complex nature and reviewer feedback suggested too many different objectives were trying to be met with the very distinct aims for the effectiveness and implementation aims.
Right.
And Alison Hoons would like to chime in with some general cross-cluster context.
Alison, please, feel free.
Thank you. Excellent discussion, and it's so wonderful to see so many people from different areas in the province and bringing different perspectives. I see names of individuals participating today from various different stakeholder groups. So thank you all for joining. I'm fortunate to be in a position where I get to speak with people from different stakeholder groups. And it's almost like there's both an excitement and a fear around using these designs. The decision makers, there's a sort of an excitement that this type of design might be one way of facilitating an increased pace in the research pipeline to practice. And so there certainly is intrigue that I've heard from several individuals in different roles within decision-making realms. The sort of evaluation specialists and QI people have shared with me that they find it appealing. There's components of it they find appealing because it's a way of, to a greater degree perhaps than usual, looking at monitoring, reporting, evaluating fidelity in application of change in practice with the research lens, of course. But I commonly hear from the researchers that there's a certain degree of trepidation in addition to what's already been voiced about how it's received by reviewers, which is, of course, of paramount importance because that affects whether you get funding or not, but also with a certain amount of concern that because of a relative unfamiliarity for themselves with these designs, ensuring that they are undertaking them in the most effective way, that they're using them appropriately in the most effective way. So it's interesting for me to see whether it was in health economics and simulation modeling meetings where there was similar interest in this design, real world clinical trials where there was interest in these designs, patient engagement, knowledge translation, implementation science, and now Rick on the line with the patient-centered measurement methods cluster. There is, a palpable pulse out there across different research areas to explore this further, but it's kind of like we need to support each other in moving forward with it. I'll be quiet now.
Great, thanks very much, Alison. So I'm going to ask probably the person with the most challenging name. I'm going to try and pronounce on the line. Mohsen Sadat-Sasavi. How does that sound? Maybe you could sort of give us a flavor of your thinking from a health economics simulation modeling perspective. Is this an area that is relevant in that context?
Thanks, Sterling. Good job for the first try on my last name. But yeah, I joined this event with that you know, wearing the hat of a economic evaluation person, and see how it is going to affect my work. So a couple of projects that we have done, like, you know, we have recommended to the potential funder of the intervention that more work needs to be done after you implemented the intervention, because we kind of acknowledge that there is difference in estimates of effectiveness that comes from the literature versus the context-specific estimates of the effectiveness of intervention that once you apply it. And when I was reading the paper during the conference call, of course, is that it is mentioned in that type 2 hybrid design. One of the reasons for type 2 is because estimates of efficacy is different when you apply an intervention versus you take it from, say, an efficacy clinical trial. But then the question that came to my mind, and might just simply show my naivety in this context, like, what is the relationship between hybrid type 2 design and a step-wedged clinical trial design? Is it not a hybrid evaluation and implementation at the same time? Does it get any connection with that?
Yeah, that's
these
a
are
great
fundamentally
question.
different things.
So I think we should, maybe Hubert wants to give us a thought on the relationship between type 2 and step wedge.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I've been trying to wrap my head around with respect to the hybrid design is the implementation aspect of it. So my understanding is that with these designs, the uncertainty lies in what method of implementation is better. And I don't think that's really being addressed in a step wedge design. You have a single method of implementation, and you're just trying to account for the fact that things change over time, and you need to adjust for that. And so there's no, I mean, a step wedge design does allow you to assess sort of implementation effects, but it doesn't allow you to compare different methods of implementation.
Mm-hmm.
But could you actually design a type 2 in the context of a step wedge?
Sorry?
So would it be theoretically possible to do a type 2 design using a stepped wedge approach? You don't have to answer that question now. Maybe that's one to ponder.
Yeah, I think it is something to think about.
Yeah. Okay.
We've got a note from Marie. She's posted this for everyone to read, but I'll read it aloud. I too am interested in specific designs, i.e. stepped wedge cluster, interrupted time series, etc., and using the stepped wedge for a type 3 hybrid design.
Okay. Great. Well, we look forward to working with you on that. I think the more we can actually get people like in BC trying to take these forward and get experience in using these sorts of designs, I think that's exactly what we're looking for. So yeah, we look forward to working with you on that, Marie.
We have another note from Don MacArthur. As participants and the paper mentioned, there's a need to educate peer reviewers, papers, grants, and tenure and promotion committee members about these study designs. Any thoughts about how to catalyze this?
Linda.
It's a great point. I asked that for about a year and a half already, and I think we're probably at the place now that people are educated by the number of publications that are out there. So, and I think, you know, the fact that there's so many people joining this journal club is, you know, sort of a testament to itself, that people are more familiar with the terms, and so hopefully the education piece will be easier. I think the challenge for us is probably to apply those designs correctly and be able to justify it. And going back to the question around whether the step wedge design can do a type 2, I actually agree with Marie that a type 3 is probably more appropriate to do a step wedge. A type 2, if you do a step wedge, the whole idea is that you actually have multiple implementation intervention that you want to test. So the examples that I've been reading is sort of around, let's say if you have two different dosage of exercise that you want to prescribe for people with arthritis, and you want to see whether clinicians will prescribe those exercises. So, the implementation intervention that you could test could be that audit and feedback or reminders. So in order to be able to test the effect of, the two different implementation intervention and the two different dosage of the clinical intervention, that would be what I see as a type 2, and I can't wrap my head around how you do that in step wedge design.
Yeah, no, I think that actually is very helpful. That makes perfect sense to me. But actually, you wouldn't necessarily want to try and complicate it. The step wedge, in some ways, is a way of dealing with like some practical challenges around rollout of an intervention. We don't want to confuse that. I think we're getting warmed up, and we've got other comments.
We do. The hand has been raised. A hand has been raised by our colleagues in Manitoba at the Centre for Healthcare Innovation. Hello, Manitoba. Welcome. What do you have to say?
Hi, this is Kate Sibley from the Centre for Healthcare Innovation in Manitoba. I lead the KT support platform here, and thanks very much for opening your webinar. Nationally, I'm learning a ton, and just sort of hearing the discussions and just sort of behind the scenes how we're all thinking about this is really sort of fascinating to me. And I don't know, I don't have a lot of experience with these designs either, but one of the things that's sort of striking to me about just sort of the terminology that we're using and how, and particularly around this question around the stepped wedge issue, is when I look at, they've called these hybrid designs, but it seems to me that the hybridness is less about the actual study design and more about the primary study outcome and how that integrates. Is it a clinical? Is the primary outcome clinical, or is the primary outcome implementation? And how do those interact? And I'm sort of thinking it that way. And so again, how does the stepped wedge fit with it, or any design fit within it? It seems to be starting with this shift between what is your primary outcome and how do we integrate the outcomes. So I don't know if I don't have an answer, but that's just sort of how I'm thinking about it. And then the other thing I'm sort of keep circling back to is how much of this is coming down to a little bit of grantsmanship, and I think that's sort of fascinating in itself as well, and I could totally chime in with all of share all of those insights as well. So those are just some of my thoughts so far, but thanks.
I love the sort of comments that actually like the high point, like what is hybrid in this? Yeah. And actually, like, it's possibly not the design that's hybrid, it's actually like the focus of the outcome or the intervention that's the hybrid piece of it. Yeah, I think that's a very helpful reflection, and I mean, terminology matters, and so maybe this is slightly misleading in the way that it's being framed. That's helpful.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks for joining us from Winnipeg. Any other comments, thoughts that people have? Did we have any other comments?
Nothing.
No.
Oh, I do have one from Linda Lee. Who apparently is feeling shy. And Linda says, question for everyone. The type 1 design stipulates that the clinical intervention needs to have some evidence of effect of the clinical intervention, but it should not be just pilot results. Too early, question mark. For people who have experience with the type 1 design, when do you think the evidence is ready to use a type 1?
That's an easy one. Who's going to take that?
Rick has raised his hand, but I don't think it was anticipating answering this question.
Oh, right. Well, you can give us an answer before you then make another comment, Rick, maybe.
Well, I don't think I have a good answer to that question as to Like I guess one thing I would say is in that it depends also on what is at stake, and that's kind of what I've been missing from these design discourses. Like, you know, with a drug trial, for instance, or some type of trial where the stakes are quite high to potential for harm, for instance. I think that the decision making is in a different space for a design where a complex intervention and maybe the potential for harm is not directly so high, and we're actually really more almost shifting more interest in the implementation part rather than just the efficacy or effectiveness part, which may actually be quite difficult to prove that part. So I think there's a tension there where our classic designs have been developed from a point of view where the stakes are quite high and really needing to prove very strongly efficacy and effectiveness, whereas these newer designs that are coming out, they have a different type of objective. And my comment that I wanted to make is in relation to the language. It relates to what I started off with earlier. I really appreciate your feedback. I think it was Kate that mentioned it on the language. And you know, what is hybrid about this, I think, is a really important thing, and perhaps a contribution we'll be able to make, because I think the word design may lead to confusion, because really what we're talking about is bringing together a mix of different types of relatively well-established designs like step wedge to then achieve a hybrid objective or an evaluation and implementation of a complex intervention. So I do actually come back to the Humpty Dumpty syndrome of needing to clarify our language.
I think that's really, really important, and I think that's going to be a lasting impression on me from this discussion. So thanks for those that have raised that issue around language. I think that matters a lot. Yep.
Another comment from Don MacArthur. Could type 1 work for a non-inferiority study comparing two medications that have same treatment efficacy but different dosing/administration protocols, e.g. oral versus injection, and so variations in implementation?
I would guess that the answer is yes to that. So that actually is sort of quite a neat, like, contained scenario where the intervention and the implementation are quite closely aligned and linked. I would have thought so. Another one?
Yeah, Kim Miller has her hand raised. Kim?
Yeah.
I think I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. I was going to say that, in fact, when you look at the tidier checklist, I think there's a lot of elements of the tidier checklist that goes along with the consort in terms of doing clinical trials, particularly we're doing more, I hate to use the word complex, but multi-part physical interventions that are taking place in different sites where there might be different contexts. I think it really can have a usefulness in really unpacking when you're looking at your outcomes and your findings. So not only the processes, but better understanding the results and how you would move forward. And I found that recently while we've been looking at our RCT, looking at who our responders and non-responders are and other attributes. I mean, I think sometimes there has to be, when you're doing real-world effectiveness, a certain amount of tailoring that's happening that you really need to understand as people are trying to apply your intervention. And it may not be so neatly packaged that everybody gets exactly the same thing, depending upon the nature of that intervention. So, I mean, I think there's probably, once again, it's language and how you're labeling. I think there's demand for more of this information, even in more classic types of RCTs, where there's those kind of interventions taking place.
Where in some ways you have some sort of almost like natural experiments happening where there is variation happening on the implementation side, and typically that would just be simply ignored, whereas there may be an opportunity to at least like get some, some partial signals out of that variation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a scenario where you've already done the efficacy sort of pilot work, and here you are just looking at how it actually works in that naturalistic context, and looking at effectiveness, but concurrently examining how other factors are at play. Yeah.
One of the things that thanks very much, Kim. That's really a great contribution, I think, as well. So one of the things that I love about this area as well is that I feel as though it's pushing us towards like a formal and necessary recognition of the importance of mixed methods in trial-based work. So I think that in order to really get a full understanding around implementation, then doing that in a partly qualitative manner, I think is probably necessary, and so that's one of the things that I find quite encouraging about and exciting about this area, because I actually love working in a mixed methods environment. I think it's just fabulous what I've been able to do so far. Good. One of the things that we wanted to have a bit of discussion to close was, because we're hoping that everyone's going to come back next Thursday to continue this conversation, and we want to just to get a sense of what people feel we should have as a focus for our conversation next Thursday, which is Thursday at 12 noon Pacific. And so we thought about the designs. Should we try and have a focus maybe on type 2 or type 3, maybe both type 2 and type 3? And I guess, but that's only a suggestion. But we just wanted to get to round off and have a bit of a conversation around where people would feel that it would be most helpful to steer the conversation that we will carry on next Thursday. So any thoughts on that from anyone?
Maybe we should go back to the slide that articulates the
need. Would you mind just going back, Linda?
Sorry, which slide talking about the discussion topic?
No, the slide that describes the three designs, the three types.
What about here?
Yeah, that one, perfect, yeah. So I guess what's on the table at the moment, a more practical running example, I think.
So Mosin says, can we have a more practical running example, like intervention, or something else that is a good example of an intervention is amenable to the three types?
Okay. So there are some examples that are included in here, and we could maybe use a couple of those. So actually take a real example and try and work it through. I think we need a paper, so it's a journal club, so we need a paper to circulate, but we could circulate a paper that is using maybe one of the designs and actually explore in our minds whether in fact the other types could have been applied. I think that would be a good idea. Any other comments or thoughts about where the focus might be for next time? So Hubert, you're going to help us, you're going to sort of lead us in the conversation, or at least kick the conversation off next time. Are you comfortable with that idea of trying to find an example of a study that has used one of these types and maybe explore whether in fact how well it worked and whether the alternatives might have been possible?
Sure. I mean, we have a small set of papers that we have already identified, and so I go through and I'll clear it with you guys first.
Okay. Great. Any other thoughts on the focus for the conversation next time? Alison, are you feeling that would make sense?
Absolutely. Sounds good. Fits in well.
Okay. Perfect. Any final comments from anyone? I mean, I'm just like, I love journal clubs, so this has been a great hour from my perspective. I hope it has from yours as well. Any final comments that people want to make?
Stelling and everybody, like, I just want to get an idea how mature this design is when the rubber meets the road. I don't know if Linda, when you were writing your grant, like, how did you calculate sample size and power for this type of design? That gets to me like really interesting and at the same time confusing a little bit.
Mohsen, that's a really great point. So for the type 1 design, I don't think it's any more complex than sort of any clinical trials that you calculate in the sample size doing the sample size calculation. We just recently submitted an LOI to Michael Smith for our implementation team, and we use a type 3. I don't know if it's going to go forward, but if it goes forward for a full application, I'll be scratching my head how to do the sample size. So I guess knocking on your door and Hubert's door.
So like having a full discussion of sample size, we've got 30 seconds left, is probably going to be outside of this journal club, but maybe that is something that we can have on the table for next week, especially if Hubert is leading, then that would be quite a natural fit, I guess.
Yeah, in fact, that has been my idea to raise that for next week.
Excellent, excellent. That's great. Good. That's so. I think we're at time. So want to be conscious of people's time, and so we'll close at that point. But I just want to say a very big thank you to Linda for leading us in the conversation, and for everyone who joined us, and especially those that participated in the discussion. And we certainly hope that you'll join us again next Thursday if you're able to, and please share the information with your colleagues. This webinar has been recorded and will be available online shortly. Any final words, Pat?
Marie sent a link to a stepped wedge cluster random design webinar that she's just done, and we will get that up on the website as well.
Good. Excellent. Good. Thank you very much, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks, Sterling. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.